Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today I thought we would have, I've not done a video in this series in a long time in my Napoleonic Basics series, and for today I thought we'd have a look at not necessarily how to paint your horses, but what colours to paint your horses. Now I know that sounds a little bit weird, but trust me, it's quite a complex subject when it comes to the Napoleonic Wars, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. So what I thought we'd look at today are the different types of cavalry regiments, mostly, and the type of horses that they would employ, and also the thoughts behind it, which were not always necessarily as scientific as you might think. Now, of course, this is in ideal conditions. Perhaps in peacetime conditions, a nation like Prussia might be able to achieve these, but most other countries, as I say, this was what you would hope to have. Now, that said, particularly after 1812 in the French and their allies' armies, if it had 3+ legs and 8 grass occasionally, then they would count it as a horse. So don't get too bogged down in this. This is just the ideals. It's quite fun if you're painting maybe guard regiments, or as I say, something like the 1806 Prussians, or perhaps the 1805 French, but please don't get hung up over it. In fact, if you're painting 1815 French, specifically 1815 French, then you're almost all the rules are out the window, because that literally was just scrape together what you can as quickly as you can. So we'll start off with the general principle that when it comes to painting your cavalry regiments, the heavier the regiment, the darker the horses. Now, that's a little bit of an oversimplification, and we'll unpack some more specific examples later. But by and large, it was considered at the time that darker horses were not necessarily more powerful, but were more able to stand the rigours of heavy cavalry work than lighter horses were. So, in a very general sense, if you're painting, say, Cuirassier horses brown, and you're not sure what colour to paint them, then you're probably best off going for a darker brown rather than a dun or a tan colour. Conversely, of course, if you're painting Hussars, then lighter colour might be the best to go for. Now, most cavalry regiments that I can think of would mount their trumpeters, their musicians, on grey horses. I'm trying to think if that was different with some of the other major nations, something like Russia. As far as I'm aware, Russia did the same thing. Prussia, I'm not 100% certain about. So if you do know, then let me know in the comments down below. But even if it's not 100% all the time, then I probably would do it with most of my units just because it helps them stand out. Now, the trumpeters are usually in a different uniform anyway, perhaps reverse colours or the imperial green and red and yellow outfit, but it just helps them stand out on the tabletop and it helps your command group look a little bit different. So usually I would go for musicians, particularly trumpeters, on grey horses. If you've got a heavy instrument horse, like for argument's sake a kettle drum horse, then again you're probably best off going for a dark colour, even if it's in a light cavalry regiment. I have a particularly nice model from Gringo 40s, who I will be adding to Salute this year. They do a really nice kettle drummer for the Empress Dragoons. Now, I've not got around to painting him up yet, but I'm really looking forward to doing it. So if we're looking at heavy cavalry regiments, we've got our dark brown horses, we've got our grey musician's horse. What about black horses? Now, black horses were considered usually for elite regiments, so they were put aside for things like the Grenadier à Cheval. The Carabineers à Cheval would ride black horses. The British Horse Guard, they would have black horses as well, and they were considered to be quite prestige animals. Now, one thing that I've not spoken about yet are horses in infantry regiments. So it would be that a field officer and above, this is particularly the case in the British Army, was allowed to ride a horse. So a field officer is a major or a company commander, and they were allowed to ride horses. Now, I think it's the same in the French Army. Certainly when I was doing my research into the Irish battalion, it was the majors and above who were riding horses there. But they would be provided by the officer themselves. They would have to be purchased privately. So if they were a wealthy officer, they may not necessarily be in a particularly prestigious regiment, but they could have like their own, maybe a black horse. As I say, they were considered to be the most prestigious. So what I would go with if I was doing infantry regiments and mounted officers, and this is a bit of a tangent, sorry, but if I'm doing mounted officers in regiments, is again, the sort of the line regiments, I'd probably go with a brown, and the elite regiments, the guard or something like that, I'd probably go with either a black horse for them or maybe even a white horse. Now, white horses were not that common, unless, of course, you are doing a Ottoman army, in which case white horses would be actually very, very common with the Mamelukes. Again, as with the heavy cavalry, the lighter the horse, the more prestigious it was. So a white horse would be more prestigious than a dun one, for argument's sake. And obviously, one of the most famous horses of the Napoleonic Wars was Marengo, who was Napoleon's white horse. I think he was an Arabian stallion, actually. And you can currently see his skeleton on display in the National Army Museum. So there you go, there's a bit of a random fact for you. I think it's in the same cabinet as an ashtray made out of Copenhagen's hoof. That was the Duke of Wellington's horse. But yeah, well, there you go. So anyway, that's a bit of a tangent. So yeah, so the darker horses, particularly the black ones, were considered to be the most prestigious. Now, during the Waterloo campaign, you had quite a large number of elite cavalry regiments in the Army of the North, in the French army. You had 2 regiments of Carabineers. You had the Gendarmes d'Elite. You had the Grenadier à Cheval. I need to buy some Gendarmes d'Elite, actually. You have the Grenadier à Cheval. Now, they would all normally ride all blacks. In this case, in the Waterloo, the only formation that was supposed to have all black horses that did were the Guard Artillery. So there's a bit of a left field one as well. When we think about horses, we don't necessarily think about the ones that drew the cannon, drew the supply wagons, and all that kind of good stuff. If you are coming to Under Eagles to Glory, the Napoleonic Wargamer we've got in Derby, see, I always manage to sneak in a little bit of a plug. If you're coming to that and you want to do a vignette, you may have like an ambulance or something like that. And objects like that can be drawn by your usual sort of mid-brown horses. Now, for paint-wise, when I'm talking about mid-brown, I often use... I've switched. I used to use a lot of oil paints. I once did a live stream on doing horses with oil paints, and that would be burnt umber, would be the colour I would usually use for that one. I've now switched to the contrast paints, which I find makes painting horses super easy. In fact, they're now my easiest part of painting the model. And I usually use Mornfang Brown for that one, or occasionally I'll use a Wildwood, the sort of the one that's not quite as red, but I quite like the reddy brown of Mornfang. Sorry, not Mornfang. That's not the contrast, is it? It's what's he called? Gore Grunter Fair. Gore Grunter Fair, that's the one I usually use. That's the sort of the reddish brown one. And that I find works really good for most of your medium cavalry, things like dragoons or heavy dragoons, things like that, basically. If you want something a little bit lighter, then I would tend to go with a paint called Agros Dunes. That's a like a dun colour. Now these I would always put over Wraithbone, which is a slightly yellow, like an off white yellowy colour. It's really good for Austrian uniforms, I find, as well. But that just gives a little bit of warmth and allows the colour it allows the horses to look like they're alive, basically. Sometimes I find with the contrasts, if you put them over white, it can just look a bit pale. It doesn't look quite so good. So if you are painting, I'm trying to sort of bring this back now to sorting out your army. If you're painting a unit of dragoons, then mid-brown would be absolutely fine. If you are wanting to designate something as an elite regiment, then you want to go for either white or black, depending on whether it's a light or a dark cavalry or a heavy cavalry regiment. I wouldn't have too many white horses in your Napoleonic army, though, unless you're going Ottomans. A grey would be far more likely to be there. Obviously, the Scots Greys, considered to be one of the premier cavalry dragoon regiments in the British Army, they would all ride greys. Again, ideally, there is some discussion about whether they actually rode grey horses at Waterloo or not. For me, particularly when you're wargaming, and particularly if you're wargaming in smaller scales, the horses are large areas, so just paint them the colour that they're supposed to be. I think something like Scots Greys in particular, you want them to stand out on the tabletop, so paint their horses grey. If you're really super desperately you want to be historically accurate, then probably about half the unit I'd do grey, and the rest I'd do various browns and blacks. But for me, my Scots Greys, I've painted all the horses as greys. Now, as I say, the horses are quite large areas, and one of the problems that people can have with painting horses is they can be very uniform. So often a way that you can break that up, and it's a way that I really like to do it, is to do different areas on the horse that are not the primary colour. So what I'm talking about here is you might have a brown horse and you might have white legs. If it's up to the ankle, it's called a sock. If it's up to sort of above the knee, then it's a stocking. As you can tell from this, I don't know really horsey terms. But on the nose, you can have like a star, which is just like a diamond in between the eyes, or you can have like a blaze, which goes all the way down. And then you can have like flesh-coloured, like near the muzzle, and all sorts of stuff like that. So just Google images of horses, or next time you're in town, there's a football match on, look at the police horses, and you'll see that there's like a million different like variations that you can do on your horses. Now that sounds all really good. However, it was considered in the early 20th or the early 19th century, that horses with these markings, like blazers or stockings or socks or whatever, they were considered to be of a lower quality than ones that were all that same colour. So for argument's sake, if you've got a black horse, if it's got one white stocking, say on the front left leg, that will be considered to be more questionable than a horse that was just completely black. And what I really like about this is, again, you can use this knowledge or you cannot. The most important thing is that the unit looks good on the tabletop. But what I like to do with it is I like to use it to tell the story of the different units in my army. So what do I mean by that? Well, say, let's go back to the example of dragoons. In fact, no, let's not talk dragoons. Let's talk hussars. Let's talk light cavalry. So the hussars were the most expensive type of light cavalry, and they were considered, they considered themselves to be elite, fighters, swordsmen of great repute, and I use that in all of its meanings. So hussars very full of themselves. You could do some nice stuff with them with quite light horses. That's like using the Agros dunes, or maybe a lighter brown. And that's great, but don't give those guys any markings, or give them a few. So, maybe not the elite company, but, maybe 2 or 3 of the horses in the rest of the unit, if you've got a unit of 12, or 2 if you've got a unit of 8, then just paint those with, the stockings or the socks, the blazers, whatever, just to break up the horses and a bit of variation. Now, when it comes to chasseurs, they were considered to be a lot more, shall we say, working class light cavalry. So for those guys, they would be lower down the pecking order than the hussars, so you could have more markings on your horses in a chasseur regiment. Now on the tabletop, it's not going to make much difference, and your opponent's probably not going to notice either, but it's just one of those things that I like to do, because then it shows just a little bit of thought, it adds a little bit of story to the army. So because my French are predominantly for the Peninsular War, I have mixed in quite a lot of horses with markings in my dragoon regiments. Because the dragoons worked really hard in the Peninsula, their horses would have been replaced quite quickly, and so you've got those ones that perhaps wouldn't have been the first choice for the quartermaster, but 4th, 5th and 6th choice, well, you get what you're given at this point. So that's it really. It's quite a short one today, because I just wanted to, I was talking to a few people over last weekend, and we were talking about, what parts of painting do you enjoy, do you not enjoy? I'm not really, I paint to game, so that's why I paint. I was talking to people who are, they just paint, and people who just played with grey armies. So we had quite a good round table discussion, really. And one of the things that people said they didn't like about historical gaming was the fact that you have to paint horses. Now, there's no horses in 40. Well, there is in my Imperial Guard army, but by and large, there's not many horses in 40k. So a lot of people, they've never painted animals, never painted horses, so they find it quite difficult to do. I'm sat here looking at a, I don't know what scale he'd be. He was 28 mil, and I printed him at 300%. I'm looking at General Van Damme's horse at the moment, and he's been undercoated for about 2 years now, and I'm quite intimidated to paint him as well. I think I'm definitely going to have to use oils on him. So it's, even someone who's quite an old grognard can find them quite intimidating, particularly in the Napoleonic period. Now, one thing that I haven't mentioned is that for some cavalry colonels, they would have different horses coloured by squadron as well. Now, they may break down, brown horses into different, like I've mentioned Dun before. So you've got different types of brown horses. Well, that's something I'm not really comfortable with going into because I don't really know that much about them. But there'll also be blacks and greys in there as well. So there were some colonels who would break them up by squadron. You can do that if you want. I tend to find that it looks a little bit disjointed on the tabletop. And also, I'm not entirely certain if it was ever, even in peacetime, if it was ever actually achieved. By having your horses look, roughly the same colour, with a bit of variation, that helps to tie the unit together. And a basic rule of thumb, as I say, this is a Napoleonic basics video. A basic rule of thumb is the heavier the unit, the darker the horse, and if it's an elite unit, then they probably would have black horses. But it's usually worth double checking that yourself. I know the Russian Guard Chevalier, Garde de Chevalier, I know they rode black horses as well. So, yeah, if you're painting an elite regiment, the chances are they rode black horses, but it's worth double checking. Something like the Carabiniers, they would have been the very bottom of the elite cavalry stakes. So Carabiniers, you could probably get away with not riding black horses, particularly in 1815. But all mine ride black horses because they're also really easy to paint as well. And again, the more prestigious the unit, the less I would add colour to the feet, the stocks and the stockings, etc. For infantry horses, I tend to put them on there because, again, it breaks up the model quite nicely. And it just shows that it's that slightly lower quality horse. For horses on limbers, absolutely go wild on things like that, because that's where they would usually have ended up. Now, a couple of announcements I would like to make. The first one, and perhaps the most important one, is I have been invited to go on to the Plastic Crack podcast. So hopefully that'll be next Monday. So keep an eye out for that. That's on YouTube. So check that out. And that's usually a round table, bunch of guys, some really cool guys. Dom from Boots on the Table, Alex from Storm of Steel was on last week or the week before. Seventh Son's on there as well. So it's a cool group of guys. And they usually have like a bit of a round table discussion while doing some painting or some other modelling. Speaking of painting, we are in British summertime. Now, I'm not going to be doing a live stream this Wednesday. That is because I'm away Monday and Tuesday, and I'm back to work for the first time in like over 2 weeks on Wednesday. So I suspect I'm going to have a very busy day, and I may not be finishing at 5 o'clock. So that's why there's not going to be one this Wednesday. But from next Wednesday, the plan is to start doing the live streams again. We still got plenty of Württembergers that you'll be pleased to hear, I'm sure. Lucas is just about to release his next Kickstarter, so we may be having a load of Young Guard added to that painting pile as well. But that's not this Wednesday, that's next Wednesday. So it basically kicks off from not this week, but the week after. As I say, keep an eye out for the Plastic Crack podcast. I'll link to it after we've recorded it as well. So I'm really looking forward to that. And I just want to say a big thank you to Michael. I was recently in the States, and he hosted me, and it was fantastic to meet him. So thank you very much for that, Michael. And that is pretty much it. So thank you for putting up with me, and I will speak to you guys later.